All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Kevin Foreman. I'm a developer evangelist here at Salesforce. That means a lot of things, but mostly it means I get to build cool things and then talk to people like you about them. So I like to say I have the best job in the world. Because I'm an employee, you get to see this slide. If you've never seen this slide before, congratulations. This is your first time. This is the forward-looking statement slide. It's here to remind us of two things. One, it reminds me, Kevin, don't make any forward-looking statements. And two, it reminds you to make your purchasing decisions on Salesforce products and services based on what is generally available. All right? Then you don't have to read all that. All right, so today we're going to talk about advanced Apex testing. This is my Twitter handle. If you have questions, comments, snide remarks, please tweet me. I love getting tweets. It makes me feel special. If I have this game I like to do, if you take a funny picture of me, put it in a tweet, you get me doing like, you know, some crazy hand gesture, the winner wins a prize. I have a little prize to give out. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about all sorts of things, advanced Apex testing. We're going to hit a couple of annotations. We're going to talk about using CSVs for data management. We're going to talk about asserting your sanity and just some general unit testing sanity checks. We're going to talk about mocks, and we're going to do things about stubbing. We're going to talk about stubbing. I have this thing that says DML is evil. That's my personal thing, so I'm going to pull out a Patronus and tell you why you shouldn't do DML in a unit test. And then at the very end, we'll have some time for Q&A. If you don't ask questions, I will ask you questions. That can get awkward. Some people don't like to talk about their breakfast. All right, so first things first. What do we want from our unit tests? This is what I want from unit tests. I want them to be fast. How many people's unit tests are fast? I'm going to put my own hand down here. We've got like 6 people who have fast unit tests. I want them to be easily understood. I want the new person on the team to be able to read the unit test and figure out what the code is doing, not the actual code. I always give the new person just the unit test for a week. I want them to be repeatable, which means I want to be able to run the unit test 5 times and get the same result 5 times. I want them to be descriptive. So when a unit test fails, I want to know what was failing, why, etc. And I want them to be definitive. I don't want any wishy-washiness. Okay? Has anybody ever heard of a Cinderella test? This phrase. It comes from the Ruby world. The Cinderella test is a test that works great until midnight, and then it turns into a pumpkin. Right. We don't want those. We don't want those. So when we talk about doing advanced Apex unit testing, this is what we're going for. Okay? We're not making advances in its clever unit testing. No, we're looking for clear, descriptive, fast, repeatable, easily understood unit tests. So the first thing I want to talk about is these 2 annotations, test visible and test setup. Is anybody using these already? I'm going to have to start adapting my script here because this is not so advanced anymore. But test visible and test setup work like this. Here's a code snippet I want to point out to you. We've got these 2 annotations in use, test visible. They annotate both a method and a private variable. Okay? When you annotate something as test visible, that means to a unit test it is a visible property or a visible method, right? Let's let you write actual private methods, private things, and then actually unit test them very easily. So how do you actually do the unit test of something you've annotated? Well, it looks like this. You're just going to reference it. You don't have to do anything special in your unit test. It's magically visible to the unit test and only to the unit test. Now, there's one caveat here. You see that @is_test at the very top? That has to be the very first line, or you won't be able to see your test visible annotated variables and methods. Questions, comments, sign remarks on that one? All right, let's talk about CSVs. This is my big one. This is the one I'm a big fan of. CSVs, not my favorite data format, but they are very powerful because you don't have to write them oftentimes. So one of the things that we can do is we can create our unit test data for individual tests. And if you've done this in your unit test, you're probably very familiar. Like create your own data for the unit test, right? That can make really long unit tests. Well, the other way to do it is to do this. You create a CSV as a static resource. You put it up in your org as a static resource. And you'll see here that I don't have anything special going on. I just have the name, website. These are accounts, right? And what I'm going to do then is that since I have it as a static resource, I'm going to be able to reference it in my code. Here's a test setup method. That test setup method is an annotation. Test setup methods are run before every test. and they greatly accelerate things for a number of reasons, but they run before every test. So here in my @test_setup method, I'm going to load my data from the CSV, and then all I have to do is tell it this is an account CSV, and then give it the name of the static resource. Okay? So why would you want to do this? Well, there's a number of reasons why you'd want to do it. First is you don't have to write that CSV. Somebody come up with a bug, somebody finds that you've got a situation where if you have O'Hara or you have a name with a UTF-8 character in it, then your marketing, your debugging team, your operations team can add a row to that CSV. You don't have to worry about it. As soon as somebody adds a row to that CSV, you can now run that test without having to deploy any code with the new data. Okay? Now, you may be thinking, that's not very advanced. It's just loading a CSV. So here's the real payoff. You can load multiple CSVs, and you can do so in order. So here we have one that is the accounts, then we have contacts, and then we have opportunities. And this is maybe something you do every day in your unit tests, where you're going to need to create 5 accounts that each have 2 contacts, and each of those has opportunities on the accounts. Right? It's fairly standard data setup for a unit test. Now, what makes this special is you can turn around and create CSVs that reference one another so that you can insert entire networks of data through the CSVs. And here's how you do it. If you look at the columns here, I've got one called ID. Let's see if I can get my highlighter to work. There we go. Okay, so I've got the IDs here, and you'll see that I've got on the lower one, I've got an account ID. And those account IDs are totally bogus, right? 1, 2, 3, doesn't make any sense. But because they're referentially sane, the account IDs are referenced in the account CSV as the ID there. Salesforce knows to go in and align those together. It makes those references automatic for you. So in this case, when we load the contact, if we've already loaded the accounts, you got to do it in order. So we load the accounts, then we go to load the contacts. Kevin Porman will be associated with Salesforce automatically. That's pretty powerful. And you can go a lot further down the line with this. You can also do the contacts and then have associated opportunities, etc., associated with those contacts. So you can build complex data chains with your account CSV, with your CSVs, load them automatically, and run off to the races with tests. Now, one of the other payoffs for this is bulk tests. If you run your unit tests and you're doing it with bulk data, you're probably running over several scenarios. As you keep adding to the unit tests, you're going to be adding more and more data to the CSVs over time. So one of the things that's really powerful about this is because you're just uploading the CSV to your org and then you're rerunning the unit tests, every time you add something to it, you're getting that data run. Okay? So if you find that you've got a bug, just go ahead and fix that bug. Here's your regression test already in your CSV. Does that make sense? Okay? Let's talk about asserting our sanity. What I mean by this is one of the things that takes a long time when you're debugging a unit test is figuring out where in the unit test things went wrong. So there's a couple things you can do with asserts to help you really narrow down fairly quickly where things may have gone wrong. One of the things that I like to do is have an assert here, and what I'm going to do is I call these sanity check asserts. So before my unit test starts, I'm going to make an assert that my data exists in a form that I expect it to be. That way, when my unit test fails, I know it's because something in the logic has changed, not something in the data has changed. Does that make sense? Okay. So if you're expecting 5 accounts, you check for 5 accounts before you run your actual code, and then afterwards you can check that your 5 accounts were modified in some way. This saves a lot of time and is actually really useful when when something actually does break. You can read through the logs and be like, okay, sanity check 1 passed, sanity check 2 passed. We ran the code, it still failed. Here's what my output was. This is what I expected. This is what I got. You dive right in and start fixing things right there. It also becomes a big lifesaver when you're doing refactoring. So you go into refactor something, and you're going to be breaking tests right and left. Right? So you refactor something. Now you know, oh, I refactored this, and it broke, but it wasn't because my data changed. So let's talk about mocking things. Are people using mocks? Okay. I get a lot of people who are using HTTP mocks. Are you mocking anything else aside from politicians? Okay. So I like to mock everything I can. The perfect example of this is an HTTP callout mock. There are some things you can do with an HTTP callout mock that can make it more useful than the sort of standard examples that we give you. This is the basic test method with a callout mock in use. So we're going to create a new HTTP mock factory object and pass that in as our mock object for this test. Why do I call it HTTP test factory? It's because I want to do something like this. I want to be able to construct a class with parameters on the fly so that I don't have an HTTP mock for every time I make a callout. I don't want to implement that class every time I have a callout, right? So I implement this as a factory. I'm going to accept some parameters, and I'm going to have that response class respond with it. So this is what that looks like. Here's my constructor, and in my constructor I'm going to accept an integer for the response code, the status, the body, and some response headers, and then I'm going to turn around in my respond method and I'm going to pass those back out. So when I create my mock object there in my test, I can reuse this time and time again. Just say, okay, this time I'm testing for a 404 error and I'm passing in these, I want these headers to come back, etc. Here's my mock object for this test. Does that make sense? Really dries up your code base. I was a consultant for a number of years, and right when this first came out, I got dropped on a project and they had nearly 100 classes that were HTTP callout mock underscore the name of the mock. And I was like, guys, we can do better than this, okay? But you can go one step further than this. Not only can you accept the parameters for a particular single callout, you can actually do this with a list of responses. And this is really useful because when you're writing a unit test, you can only set the mock once. And if you're testing a bit of code that has several callouts in sequence, you need to have those mocks come back with different values. So what we do here is we're going to accept a list of HTTP response objects, and then we're going to sequentially pass those back as the mock is called. So if we have 5 mock callouts in our code, and we're going to set up a list of 5 mock responses, the first time we make a callout, the first mock will be returned to us. Second time, the second one will be returned, and so on and so forth. This is really powerful, especially if you've got custom, like speaking from experience, if you have a custom implementation of OAuth 1 and you're having to do everything manually, that's a total of 7 callouts for an authorization code token. Getting that sort of thing and mocking it this way makes it much easier. Questions on this one? Okay. Let's talk about Stub Provider. Stub Provider is sort of mocks on steroids. Is anybody using the Stub Provider? In the software ecosystem, we have mocks and we have stubs, and stubs are kind of conceptually like a mock factory. So like we just saw with HTTP mock factory, you're going to be able to construct your stub and have it do something on the fly. So let's look at what this looks like on the Salesforce side, so inside the Salesforce ecosystem. What that will allow you to do is within your test context, you're going to be able to conditionally inject a mock object, a mock implementation of a method call, and you're going to do virtually any method call. Now, there's a caveat to that, and on the right you see some caveats apply. You can't do static methods. You can't mock a class that only has private constructors. You can't do properties. You can't do triggers. These are things you cannot mock there on the right. But anything beyond those you can mock, which is pretty much anything you're writing, right? So some of the system things you can't mock, but most of the stuff that you're going to be writing you can mock just fine, okay? Now, you notice it's called Stub Provider, and I keep saying mock, because the Stub Provider ends up giving you a mock method, okay? What it allows you to do is to stub the method. It's a mock method. When you get this, and the way these work is through dependency injection, okay? And we'll see an example here in just a second, but anything that you can dependency inject that is not a static method, et cetera, there on the right, you can stub. And these are really powerful. One Stub Provider, by the way, can handle multiple method calls. We'll see how that works here in just a second, too. So here is a Stub Provider. I want to walk you through a little bit what this does. The Stub Provider interface requires you to implement one method call, and that is handle method call. We're brilliant with our names. And there's a whole lot of things that it gets passed in here. We get the stubbed object, we get the stubbed method name, the return type, a list of parameter types, a list of parameter names, and a list of arguments. Okay? And when you have these all this passing information that comes in, you can use these to conditionally choose how you're going to respond. So if you look at this, we've got a switch statement. We're going to switch on method name. So we're going to stub the account support class. And if the method name that was being called on our account support class is awesome method 1, then we're going to return, yay, I called awesome method 1. If we're calling add two numbers, we're going to return 4. And then we can get a little bit more complex. We can say if we've got a poly method return type method name, and then we're going to check the return type as well. So if we've got a method that can either return an integer or a string, and they're named the same, we can say, okay, if we're looking for this method and the return type is an integer, return the integer. You can get really complex and really specific about what kinds of information you're going to return based on your stub provider and the decisions you make here in the stub provider. Okay? Now, this is the easy part. Building out the stub provider is the easy part. When I create a new class in Salesforce, I also create an interface and a stub provider and a unit test. I make 4 files at once. And I just start populating them as I see fit. But this way I keep pace with how things are going. If I add a new method to my class, I can go into my stub provider and add a new catch for that method name in the stub provider. This helps in unit testing as well, and we'll get to that here in a bit. Now, to show you an example of how this works, we're going to walk through dependency injection of a date formatter object that we're going to stub. So in this case, we've got our date formatter class, and it's got one method, get formatted date. It's going to accept a date helper, and then it's going to say today's date is that helper's get date. And I'm sorry, this is not the one we're going to stub. This is the thing we're testing. Now this is what we're actually going to stub. We're going to stub the date helper and get today's date. It's very simple, return today.format. And here's how we do that in code. We're going to say, here's our new date formatter, here's our new date helper, and we're going to say date formatter, get formatted date, and we're going to pass in our date helper. That passing in of the date helper, that's called dependency injection. We're passing in the dependent object, and that's how we end up stubbing this. So we're passing in this date helper. So let's look at how that looks to stub it. Here's our mock date helper. And we're going to turn around and we're going to say handle method call. That's our method for the interface. We have all this information that's coming in. And we're going to turn around and say if our stubbed method name dot equals ignores case get today's date. And we're going to have it always return hello Dreamforce. Why? Because I don't want a Cinderella test that breaks when my date changes. I want to control what output comes from my stub so that I always know what to expect in my unit test. Okay? So it's not Dreamforce, but it's always going to return Dreamforce. I can always count on that. Okay? And otherwise, if it's some other method that I haven't handled, I'm going to return null. That's our stub provider. So what it looks like to write this in a unit test is we're going to create a date helper that is a mock date helper. Now you have to cast this. You have to say, hey, this is a date helper, even though we're going to call the create stub method. And that is a method on the test class. So we're going to call test.createStub. We're going to pass in our date helper class, and we're going to create an instance of our mock or our stubbed date helper. So here's our mock date helper we're calling. We're passing that all in. So now we've created this stub, and we're going to create a new date formatter. And then as we go through into our test, we're going to actually be able to assert that hello Dreamforce is the output of the date formatter, get formatted date, with our mock date helper, date formatter. Does that make sense? It's a little confusing, may take a second to work through. These slides will all be available through the Events app afterwards, so feel free to parse them again. We'll also have plenty of time for questions. This is the real meat and bones of this presentation, is the stub provider. If you think about what you're doing here, is you're working through dependency injection. You're starting to write your code in such a way that you're passing in all of the objects that are required for things, and because you're passing them in, you can stub them. That's a shift from the way a lot of people write software, where you just sort of create the object that you need on the fly in your code. Instead of creating it on the fly, pass it in. Okay? When should you use these? You should use a stub wherever you can. It makes your unit tests a lot faster. If you think about it, when your unit tests run, they have to create all this data. They have to go find the data. They have to calculate data. And if you're saying, I'm going to overrule the implementation of a method in the stub, in the mock, so that it always returns hello Dreamforce, it doesn't have to calculate anything. It doesn't have to go get data out of the database. It's just going to always return things right exactly as you've specified. This can really speed up your unit tests. It really allows you to start backing away from doing a lot of DML and queries out of the database in your unit tests. I want to encourage you to try and mock or stub every single thing that you can. And the sort of baseline for this is, if the code being tested utilizes an injected object, you should stub it. Okay, let me repeat that. If the code you're testing utilizes a dependency injected object, you should stub it. Okay, will that require extra work? Yes, but you get into a groove. After the first couple of times, it's pretty easy to start getting into the idea of like, okay, I'm just going to stub this. Here's my stub provider for that class. Move on. Okay. Now, this is a thing that this is my hill to die on, as it were. DML in unit tests is evil. I don't think you should do it. Do you have to do it? Yes. I fully admit that. DML is querying and inserting data in the database will always be the slowest part of any web application, right? Sooner or later, you're going and retrieving data, and that process of retrieving data is relatively slower than everything else that you're doing. So don't do it. What does that look like? If you have the ability to create an object and you need to reference that object elsewhere, for about the past 4 years, we've had this little unknown property of Apex that in a test class, you can assign an ID yourself. So here we have an account. I'm going to give it an account ID. That's not a valid account ID. That's an account ID from a demo org from like 4 years ago, right? It's technically a plausible ID, right? It has the right prefix, but it's bogus. And I'm specifying that so that when I create a new contact, I can create that contact with an account ID associated to it. I've now associated that contact with that account. Now, what am I not doing here? I'm not inserting in a database. You try to insert this into the database with an ID, you get all sorts of errors. Blows up in your face. So don't do that. But the number one reason you have to insert something into the database is to get a reference for referential integrity. You don't need that anymore. Don't do it. Create your own IDs. Create a class that's a test class that it gives you plausible IDs with the right prefixes for various things. So pass an ID for an account. Boom, here you go. There it is. Right? Now you can do your referential integrity. A friend of mine works for a large corporation. They have 3 instances of Salesforce, and their unit tests take 6 days to run. Their new unit tests take about 2 hours to run. And the only thing that they're doing differently is they're not doing DML unless they absolutely have to. Now, there are some boundaries where you get to the point where you absolutely have to write something to the database. Asynchronous work. Crossing the managed package barrier, right? Because the managed packages are probably pulling from the database. So if you're going to deal with a managed package, you got to write it to the database so they can pull it. We can have that chat with the ISVs later. Don't do that. But the idea here is you don't need to. And what does it look like to actually move to that? So ask yourself these 3 questions. Am I testing anything that is related to the absolute use of DML? So am I testing a trigger? If you're not testing a trigger, you don't have to worry about that one. Do I have any need to insert these records? Am I dealing with ISV code? Am I dealing with asynchronous code? Can my code be better written to have these records retrieved be something that I can mock? This is a really interesting question. If I'm injecting objects, can I inject a mock object that already has the account specified? There's the real win. When you're pulling, when you have a service layer for accounts, and you can stub that, you can say get account and have it return a hard-coded account with a referentially valid but bogus ID. Suddenly, you're not touching the database for anything in your service layer. Now, that requires a little bit of Okay, it requires a lot of work to move to, but it has big payoffs, right? These can really speed up your tests. The big reason I don't like DML in my tests is because it's slow, right? Now, there's still going to be times you have to DML to trigger, right? You can export, and you should export all of your logic from a trigger into a trigger handler class and be unit testing that trigger handler class. But sooner or later, you've actually got to have a functional test for that trigger. So go ahead and do that there. But a lot of times, we don't need DML. We think we do, but we don't. This is the one where people come up afterwards and like, no, you have to do DML. I'm like, okay. Just think about it. Just think about it. And this is one way you can make it happen. I work with a test factory, and the test factory, one of the things that I did a few years ago is I submitted a patch that adds in the ability for you to conditionally insert it into the database. So everybody has their own test factory in their org. Go into your test factory, set up your test factory so that you can say, hey, create me an account and insert it, or create me an account and not, right? And then as you're writing your unit test, you can default to not inserting it to the database. And if that's working, great, right? If you do need it, if something's blowing up there, you can switch that, say, yes, insert it into the database. Okay, now I'm testing it there. Now you can stop and ask yourself, why do I need to insert this into the database? Okay? Every time I've worked with an org of any size scale, whether it's 3 people in a company of 50, all the way up to a company that has 9,000 users, every time they've started working through this and started asking themselves, do they need to write the unit test to hit the database, they end up dramatically speeding up their unit testing. Okay? And if you can get to market faster because you're not waiting 6 to 8 hours or days, in some cases, for your unit test to run for a deploy, big wins. This is a big win here too, the conditional assert thing. So with that, we have plenty of time for questions. I'm anticipating that there's going to be lots of questions. If you don't ask me questions, I will ask you questions. Anybody have the one? And we have the microphone up here, so I'm going to ask you to go to the microphone so that everyone can hear the question, and we'll talk about it then.
So you have not covered the parallelization of test classes. Does it not improve the performance?
Parallelization of test classes can improve the performance, but it can also cause contention issues. So if you're trying to run multiple test classes on the same objects at the same time, you can run into weird failures that are not technically failures of your code, but they're failures because you couldn't lock the database row or something like that. So I love parallelization of the test classes. I just wish I could go in there and manually choose which ones are parallel at any given time. And until I can do that, then I need to make sure that I'm writing my test classes so they're in an isolated way or using mocks so that I'm not hitting the database where those contentions can occur.
Yeah, and one more question. I missed one point. So when you mention avoid DML, does it trigger actual triggers and process builder and all?
I'm sorry, say that again?
No, when you do not use the DML statement in test classes, does it really fire triggers, process builder, and workflows?
Yeah, if you're writing unit tests for a trigger or checking to see what happens when a workflow fires or a process builder or flow, then you're still going to have to do that DML.
Okay.
But if you're not testing one of those situations, try not to. That's the challenge I give you. Try not to do DML in your unit tests.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
I have 2 questions. So if we use CSV files for data setup, is it faster than actually creating data in the data setup?
Much faster. And here's why. So I want to add a little caveat here. You should always do your CSV loading in a test setup method. And the way the test setup methods work is they're particularly well suited for doing data loading. And what happens is you run the test setup method and it snapshots the database with that data in it. Okay? And then you run your unit test and any changes can go on. But when that unit test is over, it reruns the test setup method. And now, theoretically, that means it's going to go insert a bunch of data again. But in actuality, under the covers, what we're doing is we're just rolling back the database to that snapshot. Okay? And rolling back a database to the snapshot of having loaded it once means that if you've got 15 tests in a class that are all loading that data, you're only loading it once. Okay? And then every time it's just going to snapshot it, going back to a snapshot way faster than loading it. We've also bulkified that CSV loading so that it's it's much quicker than iterating and creating 15 accounts. If you've got 15 in your CSV.
So when we are talking about bulkification, does it have the same governor limits that when I'm running a unit test, it still will be 200 records at a time? Or I can actually do a bulk test like more than 200 records?
You can, there is a limit to the number of things that you can insert through CSV, but it's based on the file size of the CSV. So it depends on how many columns you have and what data is in it. You can put a whole lot of data in via CSV. If you're testing a trigger where you're going to get that 200 batch, it's still going to be 200 at a time, but you'll have more in the database to work with.
Okay. My second question is, you did talk about the Cinderella case. How can I make sure, like, if I'm providing the ID to my test class, like account.id and giving it a bogus ID, it doesn't actually is an ID in any of the environments we are pushing through?
Yeah, so when you're providing a bogus environment, you need to set it up so that bogus ID comes from your test classes, so that as you migrate from environment to environment, it's going to pass that fake ID.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yep. Great questions.
Hey, I got a few questions here. Number one is for when you, best practice, if you have something which you want to prevent a record from getting saved in a trigger, you use record.addError. I'm curious, is there any way to say like record.hasError, so that way you don't need to call the DML in order to check and assert that a record has had an error added? You know what I mean? So if I have like opportunity helper, which is called by opportunity trigger handler, and opportunity helper has a method which says, if this is true, opportunity.addError, my error message. And I just want to test opportunity helper dot this method.
Yeah, if you're going to test validation rules or a DML preventing error, then you're still going to have to trigger the DML. The good news is the way the DML prevention works, it's not actually going to hit the database until it's checked everything. So you still see benefit there.
Okay.
Great question.
Another one is in new Lightning component, new Lightning web component framework, you have to annotate your static methods as aura enabled as well as cacheable equals true. Is there any way through a unit test to reset the cache value? So if you do it in a Lightning web component, you can do it in the JavaScript controller. You can call Apex refresh, whatever your wired parameter name is. But if you do it in a unit test, I found that your cache data is still the same. So if I have, select ID from opportunity, and then I, update that opportunity, and then I call that method, which is cached to that return statement, I'm not getting my new values per se.
So I want to challenge you on a couple of points. One, I think that's an architecture question about how you're writing your annotated methods.
Okay.
Because it's easier to abstract that out and put that in a method that is not triggered that way, so your unit test is on standard methods. That's one way to handle it.
Okay.
Two, your unit test should only test one thing.
Okay.
And so if you have one unit test that goes and hits that cacheable method, end unit test, hit it again in a second unit test, the caching should revert when you do the second unit test. So more unit tests, only one thing in each unit test.
Okay.
Some combination of those two is how I've handled that in the past. I ran into one situation where it wasn't a unit test, it was a functional test, where I still had that issue and ended up having to break it out with, hitting it with some async work. Because if you hit like a queuable or an @future and then you run stop test, that'll revert it.
Okay. And then the final thing is custom metadata. So if you have custom metadata which drives application functionality that needs to be expressed in a unit test, you can't do things in a Apex unit test such as like delete a custom metadata record, right? What I've been doing is having a getter where I return select whatever from custom metadata, and then a private test visible set where I do JSON serialize into that set. Is there any better way to do that, or is that?
Yeah.
Stub API? Okay.
I was going to say stub API, but then you were probably going to ask more questions. We can talk
Okay, yeah,
afterwards.
no worries, man. I don't want to, I'm good.
This gentleman right here who's talking is also the one who originally wrote the test factory I was talking about, the test factory that I contributed to, that I use all the time. He's the guy it's his fault. Okay?
Cool.
Great questions.
I
think you've probably just answered this question, but when you're mocking the date helper to inject it into the test for the get formatted date, I assume that you have a separate test class that's actually testing the date helper.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, you want your date helper to be functional outside of a mock.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm wondering if you have advice for, we have a legacy org with like these enormous unit tests, or enormous functional classes that are 100% static methods, which makes it very difficult for us to mock, obviously. I wonder if you have any advice for like moving off of that and making unit testing more simple for us, and also how to sell that to leadership who
Yeah.
doesn't care about unit tests.
So I'm going to give you a bunch of jumbled thoughts, perhaps not in any great order. One, you need executive buy-in. You need somebody with purse power to say, look, we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. This is what we need to do it. We need 6 months or 6 months to a year of a team that's not going to be showing business profit potential, right? And you got to be upfront with them about it. Like, this is why we're going to do it. It's going to lead to better code quality. It's going to lead to faster ability to add new features or change features and get them into our org. And you're going to have to, and the other thing that I would do is I would pile on top of that and move to DX, okay? Because you're going to get all those benefits there. You're going to get higher code quality. You're going to get faster time to market. And if you bundle those two together, you have a higher chance of getting executive buy-in. Like, look, we need to do this. This is the right way forward. It's going to cost us this much. And then the other thing that I would say is you should pick your consulting partner to help you with far more scrutiny than you've ever picked anybody to ever date. Right? You know, you should pick them, and they should go through the hardest interview of their lives before you hire them for this kind of thing.
I have a tiny petty question too.
Go for it.
Correct capitalization of the test setup decorator. Is it a capital T or lowercase t? My team has a lot of arguments about that.
Yeah, so as it turns
I
out,
noticed you used it both ways, which is why I'm asking.
as it turns out, it's case insensitive.
I know that, but like,
I have my personal opinion, which is that annotations and object names, so the actual class name, should be capitalized camel case.
okay.
And I tend to be like, where's my ruler to snap somebody's hand when they don't do it right? But it technically doesn't matter.
Thank you. I will bring that back to my team.
Do you need a ruler?
Yes. Do you have like branded rulers?
We'll work on that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the session. Really helpful to know that DML are not necessary. Didn't know that before. My question is, suppose you have an opportunity, and in our org, we always have an opportunity associated to an account. So if I were to test the opportunity trigger handler, I'm right now creating an account associating an opportunity. But in this case, is it okay for me just to create an account, no DMLs, but run the DML on the opportunity, insert an opportunity, but not the account first? And
You can't. So if you go down the route of providing bogus IDs, it's bogus IDs all the way down the referential chain. Okay. So your account would have a fake ID. Your contacts would have fake IDs. Your opportunities, if you try to insert that with a real ID, it's going to say, I don't know this account. Okay. My question to you is, what about your opportunity trigger in there that you're testing needs to insert to the database?
Because our name of the opportunity is like account name and space the employee name. So we need to have an account name in the beginning and then the employee name of the account.
We can test that logic without actually inserting something.
I was inserting the account and then the opportunity, but I was hoping, is it possible that I don't insert an account, but I do insert an opportunity and still test the same thing?
Yeah, let's talk afterwards, and I'll show you an example of how I would do it.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is great questions.
So thanks for coming. I had a question around testing managed packages, like testing custom code written around managed packages like Salesforce CPQ, for example. It eats up a lot of governor limits in the tests. The trick that, my question was around the trick you can do in test setup with the start and stop test and test setup to gain another set of limits. Do you see that staying or going away?
Oh, I don't think that's going away.
Awesome.
I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask, but I would be at the front with a pitchfork and torch if they decided they wanted to try and take it away.
Gotcha. Thanks.
The other thing I'll point out is anytime you touch a managed package, you should do so asynchronously. Right? So hit a queuable, hit an @future method. There are times where you're not going to be able to, but I always default to doing all my interaction with an ISV package through asynchronous work. Because I'm not trying to badmouth anybody, I just don't trust them. Right? The number of times where I've developed perfectly valid and good code only to have it hit the CPU governor limit because of the ISV code that it's dealing with is extremely frustrating. So I'll isolate my code out through a queuable. Use queuables. Use queuables. Okay.
So we've been using the Stub API, using Apex Mocks actually, pretty extensively.
Apex Mocks, the library from
Financial Force.
Financial Force. Okay.
FFlib.
That's slightly different than what you saw here, just so everyone's on the same
Slightly
page.
different. Under the hood, it uses the Stub API. But we love the Stub API. So a new pattern that we are thinking of adopting is different than anything I've seen anywhere else. And I'm curious about what you think of it because it kind of goes against the grain of what I've read. Like in Bob Martin's Clean Coder book, he doesn't do anything like this. All the mocking is for external dependencies. But the API is so awesome that we really wanted to use it when testing our unit under test as well so that we could test our methods in isolation of one another. Because oftentimes the class that I'm testing itself executes DML and does SOQL queries and interacts with the database as well. And so what I've done is we will have shifted the DML, those SOQL queries, to their own methods. And then when I have a method that needs to do DML or a query, I'm intercepting that call to the other method so it never happens even within the same class. And the way we're doing is by mocking the class that we're testing, and we pass that in as a static into the static from the test, the mock. And then
I would need to see that.
I'm sorry?
I would need to see that.
Yeah, and so in my constructor, I'm checking is that populated or not, that static variable. If it is, then I call the methods on it. But if it's not, I call the methods on this instead. I name it this instance. So I'm doing that, and it means that even within my own class, I'm able to not execute DML and SOQL, even though I'm treating it as though it's an external dependency, even though it's really not. And I'm wondering what kind of problems I might encounter with that I'm not expecting. Should I not use this pattern enterprise-wide? We have a massive amount of code.
There is a governor limit on the number of, for lack of a better way of succinctly explaining it, there is a governor limit on the number of abstractions.
Of abstractions?
Of abstractions. So how many things you can mock at any given time.
Oh, at once?
Yeah.
Yeah, from one method, I'm only...
Yeah. I don't know what that is off the top of my head.
Even from our triggers, so if I want to test a trigger in isolation, my trigger handler, I'll have my trigger check the trigger handler a static property, see is there a mock attached to it currently, because this is executing in the context of a unit test, and if it is, I'll grab it and call my methods on the trigger handler, using a mock, so that I'm testing the trigger in isolation.
Okay, that's interesting. I'd like to see it.
Okay.
We are out of time, unfortunately, and so I don't want them to come up to me with pitchforks and torches. But if you have questions, I'll be right outside. I'm happy to talk to you. Thank you for coming.